Captain Elias Voss had always dreamed of exploring the stars. After years of training, preparation, and sacrifice, he finally stood at the helm of his spacecraft, the luminous Voyager, ready to venture into the unknown. His mission was clear: to explore Velmera 7, a newly discovered planet, and make first contact with any intelligent species that called it home. It was a prestigious task, one that would mark him in history as the first human to make contact with an alien civilization. As the ship descended through the atmosphere of Velmera 7, Elias gazed out the window. The planet was vast, with towering mountain ranges, vast oceans, and sprawling forests. The sky above was tinged with a peculiar violet hue, and the air shimmered in a way that felt almost magical. Elias felt a sense of awe, realizing that no human had ever set foot on this world before. It was a land of mysteries and wonders, waiting to be discovered. His spacecraft touched down softly on a flat area near a small forest. The landing was perfect, steady and smooth. Elias sat back for a moment, breathing in deeply as he allowed the excitement to settle. This was it, the moment he had worked so hard for. He prepared himself for the unknown, adjusting his uniform and checking the instruments one last time. Stepping out of the ship, he activated his boots, feeling them click into place on the ground. He scanned the surroundings, noting the beauty of the landscape, the bright green grass, the strange, towering trees that looked like something out of a dream. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and the air smelled fresh and clean. Elias paused, taking it all in. This was no ordinary planet. It felt different, almost alive with a strange energy. His communicator buzzed to life. "Captain Voss, we've detected signs of intelligent life nearby," came the voice of his mission coordinator, Dr. Leela Torres, from the ship's control room. "Be careful. Proceed with caution. We don't know much about their technology or culture yet." Elias nodded, even though he knew Dr. Torres couldn't see him. "I understand, Dr. Torres. I'll stay on my toes," he replied. He deactivated the communicator and began his journey toward the source of the signal. The trees grew taller as he walked, their trunks twisting in patterns unlike any he had seen before. The grass beneath his boots seemed to hum with energy, almost as if it were alive. It was a strange, magical feeling, but Elias pushed it to the back of his mind. There was work to do. After a short walk, Elias reached a clearing, and that's when he saw them. The Velmeri. At first, it was hard to tell if they were even real. They seemed to hover, their bodies glowing faintly with a soft, ethereal light. Their features were alien, tall and slender, with skin that shimmered like glass. They had no legs, no feet. Instead, their bodies floated gracefully above the ground, supported by an invisible force. Elias stopped in his tracks. He had expected alien life, of course, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. The Velmeri turned to face him, their eyes wide with curiosity. Their gaze was intense, but not hostile. They seemed to be studying him, as if they had never seen a human before. Elias felt a slight twinge of nervousness, but he stood tall, maintaining his composure. The Velmeri spoke, but their language was unlike anything he had heard. It was melodic, almost musical, with no recognizable words. Elias fumbled with his translator device, adjusting the settings. He repeated the phrase he had practiced for weeks. "Hello, my name is Elias Voss. I come in peace." The Velmeri paused, their heads tilting slightly in unison. They seemed to be processing his words, though they clearly couldn't understand them. One of them extended a long, graceful arm toward him, and Elias instinctively took a step back. It was a gesture of curiosity, but in the unfamiliar world, he wasn't sure what it meant. Then, to his surprise, the Velmeri began to chant softly, low, melodic hums that seemed to echo through the air. Elias could feel a strange energy building, a sort of power that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The chanting grew louder, and the Velmeri began to move closer. They surrounded him, their glowing forms drifting in an elegant circle. Elias had no idea what was happening. Were they worshipping him? Was this some kind of ritual? His heart began to race. He tried to speak again, but his words caught in his throat. The Velmeri weren't speaking any recognizable language, and he couldn't understand their gestures. The only thing he knew for certain was that this wasn't just first contact. It was something much deeper, something much more profound. As the chanting intensified, one of the Velmeri reached out and gently touched his leg. Elias froze. The touch was soft, but the moment it happened, a wave of energy surged through him. It felt like an electric current running through his body. He gasped, trying to pull away, but the touch remained gentle. Then, as if in response to the touch, the Velmeri stopped chanting. They stared at his legs with wide eyes, their expressions shifting from awe to reverence. Elias looked down, confused. What had just happened? Why were they focused on his legs? He didn't know it yet, but the simple act of walking on this alien world had already marked him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The Velmeri were seeing something divine in him, something that would change the course of history. Captain Elias Voss stood motionless as the Velmeri surrounded him, their glowing bodies hovering inches above the ground. He had no idea what had just happened. The soft touch on his leg, the energy that pulsed through him, it felt like something beyond human understanding. But what truly startled him was the way the Velmeri now regarded him. Their wide, curious eyes were fixed firmly on his legs. Elias shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to react. He had always been taught that first contact was delicate, that every action could shape the future. But this was unlike anything he had prepared for. The Velmeri, silent now, continued to observe him. Their eyes followed every movement of his legs, as if they were something extraordinary. "Hello," Elias said cautiously, his voice breaking the quiet tension. He took a careful step backward, his boots crunching softly against the grass. "I'm Elias Voss. I come in peace." But the Velmeri didn't respond in words. Instead, they seemed to communicate through subtle gestures and soft hums, their faces a mix of awe and reverence. One of them, the tallest of the group, drifted closer to him, its luminous skin shifting in the light. It reached out with a delicate hand and lightly touched his boot. Elias flinched at the touch, but the Velmeri seemed unbothered, their attention focused entirely on his legs. The moment their hand made contact with the boot, there was a noticeable shift in the air around them. It was as if an unseen force had suddenly connected them. An energy, gentle but undeniable, seemed to flow from the Velmeri into Elias. His heart raced. He took a cautious step back, but the group didn't react with fear or hostility. They simply watched him, their eyes wide, almost searching for something. Elias tried to stay calm, glancing around the group. They seemed peaceful, but their behavior was nothing like any first contact protocol he had read about. They weren't asking questions, they weren't introducing themselves. They were just staring, not just at him, but at his legs. Elias began to realize that something about his legs was the center of their attention. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Elias asked, his voice trembling slightly. He had never felt so unsure of what to do. It was as if the Velmeri were waiting for something he couldn't quite understand. The tall one, whom Elias began to think of as the leader of the group, gestured toward the sky, and then back to Elias' legs. The other Velmeri followed suit, repeating the same motion, their eyes locked on his legs. It was as if they were trying to connect him with something larger, something divine, something out of their reach. A few minutes passed in awkward silence. Elias's mind raced. He had never heard of an alien species having such an intense, unexplainable reaction to something as simple as human legs. In fact, he knew nothing about this planet's culture. Could their people have evolved differently? Could they have never seen creatures with legs before? But if that was the case, why did they seem so certain about the meaning of his presence? Then, without warning, the leader of the group suddenly raised both of its arms, and the others followed suit. The air shimmered with energy as their forms began to glow even brighter. They began to chant, a soft, melodic hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath Elias. The sound was rhythmic, almost like a prayer, and it filled the air with a sense of deep reverence. Elias's heart skipped a beat. He had studied alien languages and cultures, but this was nothing like he had prepared for. His training told him to maintain composure, but deep down, he could feel a sense of awe rising within him. The Velmeri weren't just observing him, they were worshipping him. The realization hit him like a wave. These beings, with their powerful telekinetic abilities and graceful floating forms, had no legs. They hovered through the air, their bodies supported by an unseen force. In their society, legs were a symbol of the divine, something they believed their gods possessed. And now, here he was, a human, walking on the ground in front of them, and to them, it was nothing short of miraculous. Elias took a deep breath and tried to make sense of the situation. He wasn't a god. He wasn't a divine being. He was just a man, an explorer sent to discover new worlds. But the Velmeri had no way of knowing that. To them, his ability to walk, to stand on 2 feet, was something unimaginable, something sacred. He raised his hand slowly, trying to signal peace. "I'm just a human. I'm not your god," he said firmly. "I'm here to learn about your culture, to make friends. Please, let me explain." But the Velmeri didn't seem to hear him. They continued their chanting, their voices growing louder, the energy in the air intensifying. They began to circle around him, their movements graceful, almost as if they were dancing. Elias's heart raced as he tried to step out of their circle, but they followed him. Their movements synchronized in a way that made him feel like he was the center of a ritual he didn't understand. For a moment, Elias stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Should he run back to the ship? Should he try to communicate again? But before he could make any decision, one of the Velmeri floated forward. It was the same one who had touched his boot earlier. This time, it reached up and placed its hand gently on his leg, just above the knee. The moment the Velmeri's hand made contact, Elias felt a surge of warmth, almost as if the energy of the entire planet was flowing through him. He gasped in surprise, his eyes widening as the Velmeri's touch seemed to awaken something deep within him. It was a feeling he had never experienced before, an overwhelming sense of connection, as if he were part of something greater than himself. For the first time since his arrival on Velmera 7, Elias realized just how far from home he truly was. Elias Voss was no stranger to the overwhelming weight of discovery, but nothing in his training had prepared him for the awe that the Velmeri showed toward him. His legs, just a simple part of his human anatomy, had become the center of their world. The strange sensation of their touch, the chanting, the radiant glow around them, it all felt like a dream. But there was no mistaking it. The Velmeri believed he was something more than just a visitor. They saw him as divine. Elias stood still, unsure of how to handle the situation. The Velmeri had surrounded him, their glowing forms hovering gracefully around him, eyes filled with worship and wonder. They no longer appeared to be merely curious. They were revering him. The leader, the tallest among them, was still hovering close to him, its translucent skin shimmering as it silently studied him, as though waiting for something. Elias felt a knot form in his stomach. He had never imagined something like this. "Why are you doing this?" Elias asked softly, though his voice was drowned out by the constant hum of their chanting. The sound was gentle, but it filled the air with a strange energy, vibrating all around him. The Velmeri continued to hover, eyes fixed on his legs, as though his every movement was sacred. Unable to shake the feeling of confusion, Elias took a slow, measured step back. His boots brushed against the soft grass beneath his feet, and the Velmeri followed his every move. They weren't just watching him. They were drawn to his legs. The tall one, who seemed to be the leader, reached out again and touched his boot with a delicate hand, repeating the gesture from before. This time, the contact was gentle, almost tender, and the moment it happened, Elias felt an unexpected warmth spread through him. It was different from before, less of an electrical shock and more of a gentle pull, as if the planet itself was connecting with him. Elias couldn't explain it. His body had no logical response to the sensation, but it wasn't unpleasant. He wanted to pull away, to ask the Velmeri why they were treating him like this. But something held him in place, a silent understanding that seemed to flow from the Velmeri. They weren't hurting him. They were revering him. The energy that surrounded them was not hostile. It was filled with awe, a pure reverence for something they believed was beyond their reach. For the first time since his arrival on Velmera 7, Elias began to wonder what exactly the Velmeri had been through. He had learned nothing about their history, their culture, or their way of life. He had been too focused on the scientific mission of first contact to consider the deeper implications of meeting an alien species. But now, standing in the middle of their strange, glowing circle, Elias couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility. They saw something in him, something that went beyond his human form, something that made him a symbol to them. The chanting slowly quieted, and the leader of the Velmeri floated a little closer, its eyes narrowing in thought. The group's hums faded to a gentle whisper, and Elias could finally hear himself think. The Velmeri leader made a slow, deliberate gesture, pointing toward Elias's legs and then looking at the others. A conversation seemed to be happening silently between them, their eyes shifting from him to each other with an almost unreadable intensity. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the leader spoke. The voice that emerged was soft but commanding, its melodic tones unlike anything Elias had ever heard before. There were no words, just a sequence of harmonious sounds, as though they were singing rather than speaking. The sound was beautiful, almost haunting, and Elias had a strange sensation that the Velmeri's language was more than just a method of communication. It felt like an expression of belief, an outpouring of something deep and sacred. The leader gestured toward the ground, then at Elias's legs, and then back at the sky. It was as if they were showing him a path, pointing to something higher, something divine. The other Velmeri nodded, their faces filled with awe as they repeated the same motion. Elias felt his stomach tighten with a growing realization. The Velmeri were not just curious about his legs, they were seeing them as a direct connection to the divine. "Wait," Elias said, his voice trembling slightly. "This isn't right. I'm just a human. I'm not a god. I'm here to learn, to explore." His words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The Velmeri didn't respond. They simply continued to watch him with unwavering reverence. The leader reached out again, gently brushing its fingers against his leg as it made soft, melodic sounds. Elias felt the warmth again, and this time it was even stronger, filling his entire body with a sense of peace. It was as if the Velmeri believed that his very existence was a blessing, that he was something that had descended from the heavens to guide them. But that wasn't true. Elias was no god. He was just a man. Yet, standing there, surrounded by these beings who had no legs, who had never known the experience of walking as humans did, Elias began to see the gravity of the situation. To the Velmeri, his legs represented the impossible, something that they could never have. Their species had evolved without them, relying on telekinesis to move, their bodies floating effortlessly through the air. To them, his legs were a connection to a higher power, something divine. And Elias was standing here, with them, as a living symbol of that divinity. Elias wanted to explain, to make them understand that he was not their god, that he was a human explorer, just like them. But as the Velmeri chanted softly, he couldn't help but feel the weight of their belief. Their worship was not born from malice or misunderstanding. It was born from a deep, unshakable conviction that he was something they could never be. The burden of that realization settled heavily on his shoulders. He didn't know how to guide them, how to show them the truth. But one thing was clear. His role here would not be what he had expected. The Velmeri believed in him. And somehow, that belief would change everything. Elias Voss stood motionless as the Velmeri surrounded him, their glowing forms floating in graceful circles. His mind raced with confusion, but his body remained still, almost frozen by the sheer weight of their reverence. The creature's eyes were fixed on his legs, as though they saw something far beyond the physical. He had always been just a man, an explorer, sent to a distant world to study and report. But here, in this strange place, he had become something more. The Velmeri had made him into a symbol of divinity. His heart was pounding. He had tried to explain himself, told them that he was not a god, that he had no extraordinary powers. But their silent, unwavering belief in him had drowned out his words. They had no understanding of humanity the way he did. To them, his legs, his ability to walk, were nothing short of miraculous, something they could never hope to experience. "Why are you doing this?" Elias repeated, though his voice barely carried over the soft chanting of the Velmeri. There was no answer, only the melodic hums that filled the air and seemed to pulse with energy. The leader of the Velmeri floated closer to him, its translucent skin glowing softly. The creature reached out with a long arm, its fingers lightly brushing against Elias's calf. The touch was gentle, yet it sent another wave of warmth rushing through his body. This time, the sensation was not as surprising as before. Elias had felt it several times now, and he couldn't deny that it seemed to carry some deeper meaning. It was as though every time they touched him, every time they circled around him, they were reaffirming something important. But what was it? And why him? Elias's thoughts were interrupted as the Velmeri leader slowly floated backward, its eyes never leaving his legs. The others followed its movement, still maintaining that same intense, almost worshipful gaze. The energy in the air seemed to hum louder now, vibrating through the ground, through the very atmosphere. Despite his growing unease, Elias couldn't help but be awestruck by the beauty of it all. The way the Velmeri moved, how they floated so gracefully, how their forms shimmered in the twilight light. It was a vision unlike anything he had ever witnessed. But there was no time for admiration. He had to find a way to make them understand. He needed them to see that he wasn't their god, that he was just a man, lost on a distant planet. But no matter how hard he tried, it felt as if his words couldn't reach them. A new thought began to form in his mind, one he couldn't shake off. Maybe the Velmeri had no concept of humanity at all. Perhaps they had never encountered beings like humans before, and so they had no reference for what Elias was. The idea that his simple human body, his legs, were seen as something extraordinary began to make more sense. But the idea that they would treat him as divine was something entirely different. As the chanting grew louder, the leader of the Velmeri raised its arms once more. The others did the same, and for a moment, Elias felt like he was at the center of an ancient ritual, one that had been waiting for him, perhaps for centuries. The Velmeri slowly moved to form a perfect circle around him. Elias felt a growing sense of awe mixed with confusion. He could feel their belief in him. It wasn't just a passing admiration. It was deeper than that. It was a connection. Something unspoken. "Please, listen to me," Elias said, his voice tinged with desperation. "I don't understand what you're doing. I'm just like you. I walk. I'm no different." The Velmeri didn't respond. Their eyes remained fixed on him, and the chants continued. It was clear that their focus had shifted from curiosity to something much more profound. They were now worshiping him, not because they thought he was a god, but because they believed he was the answer to something deep within their culture. His legs represented something they had longed for, something they could never achieve. Their species had evolved without legs, using telekinesis to move through the air. The idea of walking was beyond their grasp, a mystery that had haunted them for as long as they could remember. And Elias was the answer to that mystery. But why him? Why had he been chosen? The leader of the Velmeri floated forward again, but this time it did not touch his leg. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, studying him as though seeing him for the first time. Its eyes were full of wonder, But there was also something else in them, something almost human. Hope. Elias felt a pang in his chest. These beings were not so different from humans after all. They had their own desires, their own struggles, and they had been looking for something, someone, to bridge the gap between them and the divine power they believed was beyond their reach. It was then that Elias realized his mission had shifted. He was no longer just an explorer. He had become a symbol, an embodiment of something far larger than himself. But how could he handle that responsibility? How could he communicate with these beings, these people who saw him not as a fellow being, but as an answer to their deepest, most profound question? Elias could no longer ignore the growing sense of duty that weighed heavily on his shoulders. If he was to leave a lasting impact on this world, it would have to be more than just teaching them about humanity. He needed to help the Velmeri find their own path, their own understanding. He needed to show them that they didn't need to worship him or see him as something divine. They had their own power. They had just forgotten how to use it. He looked around at the Velmeri, their eyes glowing in the twilight. In their presence, Elias felt both humbled and burdened. The next steps he took would define not only his future, but also theirs. He wasn't sure what to say next, but he knew he couldn't leave them in this state of confusion. They needed him, not as a god, but as a guide. "Let's figure this out together," he said, his voice steady despite the swirling emotions inside him. "I'm here to help, but we need to learn from each other." The Velmeri paused, the chanting dying down. The leader drifted closer, and for the first time, Elias saw a glimmer of understanding in its eyes. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something truly remarkable. The air around Elias grew still as the Velmeri fell silent. For the first time since his arrival, the gentle hum of their chant faded, leaving only the soft rustle of wind across the alien grass. The glowing beings, whose eyes had never left his legs, now paused, as if waiting for him to speak again. Elias felt the weight of their attention settle over him, more intense than ever. They believed in him, perhaps too much. He had said it before, and he would say it again. He wasn't their god. He wasn't anything special. He was just a man, an explorer, here to learn and discover. But somehow, the Velmeri had seen something in him that he couldn't fully understand. His legs had become a symbol of something far beyond their reach, a connection to something greater. Elias wasn't sure how to break through their belief, how to show them that they didn't need to worship him to find what they were seeking. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that perhaps he wasn't meant to undo their belief. Maybe, instead, he could use it to guide them towards something they needed, something they had lost. The leader of the Velmeri, still hovering at the front of the group, slowly raised one hand and gestured toward the horizon. Its glowing skin shimmered faintly in the fading sunlight, giving it a soft, ethereal appearance. Elias followed the leader's gesture, but the horizon was vast and empty, just endless stretches of the alien landscape. What could the Velmeri possibly want from him? What were they seeing in the horizon that he wasn't? Elias knew there was no simple answer, but the more he looked at the Velmeri, at their delicate forms and unwavering gaze, the more he realized that they were looking for something. They weren't just admiring him. They were waiting for something to change, something to bring them closer to the understanding they longed for, and he was somehow tied to that change. "Are you asking me to help you?" Elias asked cautiously, unsure if he was interpreting their actions correctly. "To teach you how to walk, how to move like I do." The leader's eyes brightened at the question, and it nodded slowly. The others followed suit, their glowing bodies shifting as they all seemed to acknowledge the idea. Elias's heart sank. He hadn't expected them to answer so quickly, so eagerly. They saw him not as a mere human, but as a teacher. But how could he teach them? How could he show them something that was so deeply human, so fundamentally different from their own way of living? For a long moment, Elias remained still, unsure of what to say or do. But then, something inside him shifted. He wasn't a teacher in the traditional sense. He wasn't a scholar who could simply pass on knowledge. But he had something that the Velmeri lacked: experience. He had spent his entire life learning, adapting, growing. He had walked, run, climbed, and danced across Earth's diverse landscapes. He had lived with his legs, had made them part of himself. Maybe that was what the Velmeri needed to understand: that walking wasn't just a physical act, it was something far more profound. Elias looked at the Velmeri again, their glowing forms hovering around him. Despite their otherworldly appearance, despite their glowing skin and telekinetic abilities, they were just as curious and eager to learn as any human being. They weren't so different from him. And he realized, in that moment, that he didn't have to teach them to walk. What they needed was for him to help them discover what they already had within them. He stepped forward, feeling the weight of the Velmeri's gazes on his every move. He crouched down, carefully placing his hands on the soft ground beneath him. The sensation was familiar, grounding. The Velmeri moved closer, their floating bodies just above the grass. The leader hovered closest, watching every gesture Elias made. He stood up slowly, demonstrating the movement. His legs carried him easily, without hesitation. But he didn't just walk. He let the motion of his body tell a story, one of balance, strength, and trust in his own abilities. Walking is more than just putting one foot in front of the other, Elias said softly, his voice carrying the weight of the knowledge he had gained over a lifetime. It's about feeling the ground beneath you, finding your balance. It's about trusting yourself to move forward, even when the path is unclear. The Velmeri watched him intently. Elias felt a deep connection to them at that moment, an unspoken bond of understanding, a shared desire for growth and learning. It wasn't about legs. It was about movement, about progress. It was about finding your place in the world, just as Elias had done, just as they had done. Slowly, he moved again, this time with more purpose. He demonstrated walking in a circle, using his arms for balance, feeling the pull of gravity beneath him. It was simple. It was natural. He could see the Velmeri's eyes tracking his every movement, their faces filled with curiosity. They were learning. Elias could feel it. He paused, looking at the leader, who was still hovering just a few feet away. The Velmeri leader made a soft gesture toward its own legs, or rather, where legs might have been, for they were simply not there. Instead, it moved through the air, its form floating effortlessly. Elias could see the longing in its eyes, the desire to experience what he had. But it wasn't just physical. It was a yearning for understanding, for connection. "You have your own way of moving," Elias said gently. "You don't need legs to find your path. You already have the ability to move through the world. But maybe together, we can learn to move in new ways." The Velmeri leader tilted its head, as though considering his words. The other Velmeri nodded in unison, their glowing forms shifting in the air. Elias realized that his purpose here wasn't to change them or make them walk. It was to help them realize that movement came in many forms. The Velmeri had telekinesis. They had mastery over their own floating bodies. But it was their belief that needed to change. They didn't need to be like humans to be complete. They were already enough as they were. And so, Elias began to teach them, not how to walk, but how to embrace the different ways they could move through their world. Together, they would find their shared path forward. The days that followed were unlike anything Elias had ever experienced. The Velmeri, once so focused on his legs and the idea of walking, had slowly begun to shift their focus. They watched him with newfound curiosity, not just as a figure to worship, but as someone who could help them understand movement in all its forms. They still saw something extraordinary in him, but it was no longer about him being a divine being. Now, it was about learning together. Elias had spent countless hours walking, running, and demonstrating the basic principles of movement. But it was not just about showing them the physicality of walking. It was about helping them understand the deeper connection between body, mind, and the world around them. The Velmeri's telekinetic abilities were extraordinary in their own right, But Elias could see now that what they lacked was the experience of physical contact with the ground. They had no understanding of the limitations and freedoms that came with having a body that could touch the earth, feel the air, and interact with the world in a completely tactile way. He had started with simple exercises, small movements, shifts in balance, and basic walking patterns. At first, the Velmeri hovered around him, watching intently, eager to absorb every gesture, every shift of his body. Their eyes followed his movements, their glowing forms reflecting a quiet fascination. As Elias demonstrated how to bend and straighten his knees, how to shift his weight from one leg to the other, the Velmeri began to mimic his motions, though not always perfectly. They floated gently, trying to adapt their telekinetic powers to these new movements, but it was clear they were struggling. One evening, after a long day of practice, Elias sat down on the soft grass, exhausted but content. The Velmeri gathered around him, their luminous faces filled with quiet contemplation. The leader, who had once regarded him with such reverence, now seemed more like a student, its eyes searching for understanding in every movement Elias made. It floated just above the ground, its long, graceful arms extended slightly, as though feeling the air in the same way Elias had shown them. "You're doing well," Elias said with a tired smile. "You're learning to feel the world, to connect with the ground beneath you. It's different, but it's a good start." The leader blinked its large eyes and made a gentle movement with its hand, mimicking Elias's earlier gesture of bending and straightening its body. It didn't move as fluidly as he did, but it was trying. The other Velmeri followed suit, some more hesitant than others. Elias could see the determination in their eyes, and it filled him with hope. He had learned to walk through years of practice, years of small steps, of falls, and of getting back up. He knew that the Velmeri, despite their telekinetic gifts, had never experienced the simple act of walking. They had never known the challenges and triumphs of a body that could stumble, fall, and rise again. They had to learn how to trust their bodies, how to find balance in ways they had never thought possible. But Elias believed they could do it. They were intelligent, adaptable, and deeply committed to learning. The next few days were a blur of practice, trial, and error. Elias would demonstrate a movement, and the Velmeri would attempt to mimic it, using their telekinesis to move their floating bodies. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of frustration when they couldn't quite get it right. But Elias never gave up. He knew that learning, real learning, wasn't about perfection. It was about progress, about taking each small step forward, no matter how slow. One day, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the alien landscape, Elias stood before the Velmeri, watching them with a quiet sense of pride. The leader had managed to float closer to the ground than before, its body hovering just inches above the grass. It bent its legs and straightened them, its movements slow but steady. The other Velmeri were doing the same, each one showing more confidence than before. Elias smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment that went beyond anything he had ever felt in his own life. They were no longer just learning to walk. They were learning to connect with the world in a way they had never imagined. The Velmeri were starting to understand the importance of balance, the need to feel the ground, to experience the world through touch and movement. He took a step forward, slowly and deliberately, making sure they were watching him. The Velmeri followed suit, their movements still hesitant, but with an unmistakable determination. Elias led them in a slow circle, guiding them through each step with care and attention. There was no rush, no need for perfection. They were moving together, finding their own rhythm. For the first time, Elias realized that the Velmeri weren't just learning how to walk. They were learning how to belong. They were no longer strangers to the earth beneath their feet, to the world that humans had always taken for granted. The connection they had longed for, the connection to the physical world, was slowly being forged, step by step, just as it had been for Elias himself. The leader floated closer to Elias, its large eyes reflecting the glow of the setting sun. It extended one of its delicate arms toward him, a soft gesture of gratitude. Elias reached out, placing his hand gently on its arm. The leader's skin was warm, and for the first time, Elias could feel a bond with these beings that went beyond the strange, spiritual worship they had once shown him. "You're making progress," Elias said softly. "This is just the beginning, but you're on the right path." The Velmeri leader tilted its head, as if understanding the deeper meaning of his words. Slowly, the others gathered around, their bodies glowing softly in the fading light. Elias couldn't help but feel that, in some way, they had become a family, one that had discovered a shared journey of learning and growth. And as they moved together, he knew that the path they had chosen would lead them to new heights, ones they never thought possible. The Velmeri were learning not just how to walk, but how to move through the world with a deeper understanding of themselves and each other. And in that, Elias found his own sense of purpose. The weeks that followed were full of quiet growth and steady progress. Elias had become more than just a guide to the Velmeri. He had become a companion, a fellow traveler on a journey that was as much about understanding themselves as it was about learning new ways of moving. Each day, they practiced together, slow, deliberate steps, careful movements, and moments of triumph when one of them took a step further than before. The Velmeri had embraced the challenge of walking, of grounding themselves in the world that had once seemed so distant, so unattainable. Elias could see the change in them. At first, they had only been fascinated by his ability to walk, seeing it as something miraculous, something beyond their reach. But now, they were beginning to see it differently. It wasn't about him at all. It was about them, about their own potential to connect with the world in a new way. They were learning to trust their bodies, to feel the earth beneath them, and to embrace movement as a part of their very essence. One day, as Elias stood at the edge of a large open field, watching the Velmeri practice, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The sun was setting, casting long, golden light over the landscape. The Velmeri were moving gracefully now, floating just above the ground, bending and straightening their bodies in fluid motions that mimicked walking. They were no longer struggling with every step. They were moving with purpose, with confidence. The leader of the Velmeri approached Elias, its glowing form shimmering in the soft light. It had come a long way since the first day they met. Its movements were smoother now, more controlled. It no longer hovered uncertainly, but instead moved with the same sense of grace that Elias had shown them. It was no longer just learning to walk. It was learning to be in the world, to experience it through the power of its own body. "You've come so far," Elias said, watching the leader move closer. The Velmeri leader's eyes, once filled with uncertainty, now radiated a quiet confidence. The others gathered around, watching the leader as it took a few more steps forward, its body floating just above the ground. The leader extended one of its arms toward Elias, a silent gesture of gratitude. Elias reached out to touch it, feeling the warmth of its skin beneath his fingers. The connection between them was no longer just about him teaching them to walk. It was about their shared journey, their shared discovery of what it meant to move through the world with purpose. "You've done more than learn how to walk," Elias continued. "You've learned to be a part of the world, to feel it, to experience it. And that's what matters most." The Velmeri leader tilted its head as though contemplating his words. Elias smiled. He had been on his own journey too. His mission on this planet had started with a simple goal: to study, to observe, to learn. But over time, he had realized that it wasn't just about gathering information. It was about connection. It was about growth, both his own and theirs. Together, they had learned something profound. That movement, no matter the form, was a way of being in the world. The Velmeri had learned to move with purpose, to feel the ground beneath them, and to embrace their own unique abilities. Elias had learned that even in a strange and unfamiliar world, there was always something to be discovered, something to be shared. As the days turned into weeks, Elias found himself growing closer to the Velmeri. He had come to this planet alone, uncertain of what he would find. But now he was no longer just an outsider. He had become a part of their world, a guide on their path to understanding. And in turn, they had become a part of his. The connection between them had deepened into something far greater than just teacher and student. They had become friends, equals, each learning from the other. The leader of the Velmeri stepped back, its glowing form radiating with pride. It motioned to the others, and they all began to move together, their bodies gliding through the air in perfect harmony. It was no longer just a series of hesitant steps. It was a dance, a fluid expression of movement and connection that felt almost like a celebration. The Velmeri had found their rhythm, and they moved together as one, their glowing forms shimmering in the twilight. Elias watched them, feeling a sense of deep satisfaction. They had learned so much, and he had learned just as much from them. It wasn't about physical ability alone. It was about the journey of discovery, the understanding that came from embracing the world with open arms and a willingness to learn. As the Velmeri danced through the field, Elias stood back, his heart swelling with pride. He had helped them find their way, but they had also helped him find his. He had come to this world with a mission, but he was leaving it with something far more important, a deeper understanding of connection, of movement, and of the shared journey that binds all beings together. In that moment, Elias realized that his time on this planet was coming to an end. He had given them the tools they needed to continue their journey, to grow and evolve in ways they had never imagined. And now, it was time for him to return to Earth. But as he turned to leave, he knew that the Velmeri would continue their path, their journey towards self-discovery, and that they would carry the lessons they had learned with them always. Elias took one last look at the Velmeri, his heart full of gratitude and hope. They had found their way, and he had found his. And in the end, that was all that mattered.